Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Hope's world implodes the moment Daphne's voice cuts through the room, calm but ruinous, as the DNA report is exposed and every precisely erected taradiddle, every fragile dream Hope participated with Carter, collapses under the weight of cold, irrefragable wisdom, because this isn't just a piece of paper, it's a disclosure that rewrites individualities, commitment, and love itself, turning what formerly felt like fortune into treason and query, and as Daphne stands there holding the evidence like a armament she didn't indeed need to raise her voice to use, the air shifts, the silence grows unsupportable, and Carter's expression changes from confusion to shock to commodity far worse, clarity, because in that moment he understands that the life he allowed he was erecting with Hope was constructed on a foundation that was no way solid, no way honest, and no way truly theirs to begin with, and Hope, pulsing, watches his eyes darken as the verity settles in. Realizing too late that love cannot survive when its roots are poisoned by secrets this deep, this particular, this enduring, and Daphne's disclosure doesn't just expose DNA, it exposes intentions, fear, despair, and the quiet manipulations Hope convinced herself were necessary to cover what she loved, indeed as they eventually destroyed it, because Carter isn't just replying to the natural shock of the report, he's replying to the emotional fallout of knowing Hope knew, or suspected, or ignored the possibility, and chose silence over honesty, chose control over trust, and in that choice sealed their fate, so as the words "it changes everything" hang in the air, they aren't dramatic magnification but absolute verity, because Carter sees now that the future he imagined, marriage, family, fidelity, has been rewritten by a reality he was no way allowed to assent to, and Hope's hopeless attempts to explain, to justify, to reframe the history as love-driven rather than sweat-driven, only consolidate the crack, because Carter hears not guilt but fear, not responsibility but preservation, and Daphne, whether she intended to or not, becomes the catalyst for the unraveling, the bone who pulled the thread that revealed the entire shade was false, and as Carter steps back physically, emotionally, spiritually, it's clear he's formerly walking down in his mind, grieving not just the relationship but the interpretation of Hope he believed in, the woman he trusted with his heart, and Hope's desolation is raw and inarguable as she realizes that this time gashes wouldn't fix it, passion wouldn't stamp it, and love alone isn't enough to survive the kind of treason that strikes at the core of identity, because DNA isn't just about biology, it's about verity, lineage, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we're and who we belong to, and Daphne's disclosure has stripped Hope of the narrative she controlled, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and facing consequences she no way imagined would be this final, this absolute, as Carter's voice cracks when he says he needs to leave, not because he doesn't love her, but because love without trust is a captivity, and staying would mean losing himself to a reality he cannot accept, and in that moment Hope's world truly shatters as she watches him walk down, every step echoing like a verdict, knowing that the man she fought so hard to keep is gone not because of another woman, not because love faded, but because the verity arrived too late, carried in the hands of someone who refused to let a taradiddle mandate the future any longer, and Daphne's part becomes both villain and reticent idol, the bone who ended a love story by averring reality be conceded, forcing Hope to defy the ruinous verity that some secrets do'nt cover love, they poison it, and as the fate settles, Hope is left alone with the remains of what she formerly believed was unbreakable, visited by the knowledge that if she had chosen honesty sooner, if she had trusted Carter with the verity rather of trying to control the outgrowth, the ending might have been different, but now all that remains is remorse, loss, and the unrecoverable understanding that DNA didn't just end Hope and Carter, it revealed who they truly were, and occasionally the most shocking exposures aren't about where we come from, but about how far we're willing to go to avoid losing love, only to lose it anyway when the verity eventually comes to light. Picking up from that ruinous moment without pause or paragraph break, the fallout continues to helical as Hope stands firm in the fate of Carter's departure, her mind replaying every discussion, every near concession, every moment she nearly told the verity but induced herself that love would ever be stronger than data, because now the room feels concave, stripped of warmth, and Daphne's presence lingers like an echo she sees silence, not because Daphne is still speaking, but because the verity she unleashed refuses to be contained, expanding outward into every corner of Hope's life, touching family, heritage, and tone worth, and while Daphne didn't raise her voice or bewail, the quiet certainty with which she presented the DNA report makes it insolvable for Hope to paint her as the villain she desperately wants her to be, because villains are easier to detest than glasses, and Daphne has come exactly that, a reflection of the reality Hope tried to overrun. And as the hours pass and Carter doesn't return, the futurity of it all begins to sink by, not as a dramatic explosion but as a slow, suffocating consummation that this bifurcation isn't temporary. This isn't a misreading that can be smoothed over with justifications and grand gestures. This is a abecedarian fracture caused by a verity that cannot be undone, rewritten, or forgotten. And Hope's grief deepens when she realizes that Carter didn't just walk down from her, he walked down from a future that now feels defiled by mistrustfulness, because indeed if she could ever explain every choice she made, indeed if she could move him, her intentions were embedded in love rather than manipulation. The DNA report will always live as a silent third presence between them, a document that says further than words ever could, and as night falls and Hope sits alone, the weight of her opinions presses down harder than ever ahead, forcing her to defy uncomfortable questions about herself, about why she believed control was safer than vulnerability, why she assumed she alone could manage the verity without consequences, and whether her fear of losing Carter eventually guaranteed that exact outgrowth. While away Carter wrestles with his own storm of feelings, torn between heartache and tone preservation, replaying the moment Daphne spoke, flashing back how Hope's face changed, how the vacillation and fear in her eyes told him everything he demanded to know before she indeed opened her mouth, because trust isn't just erected on honesty, it's erected on the belief that the person you love will choose verity indeed when it's intimidating. And realizing that Hope didn't make that choice cuts deeper than the DNA disclosure itself, making him question not just their relationship but his own judgment, his own amenability to overlook red flags in the name of love, and this tone mistrustfulness becomes its own crack, one that makes the idea of returning sense insolvable, because staying would mean constantly wondering what differently he doesn't know, what other trueness might still be hidden beneath solace and pledges, and Daphne, too, feels the consequences of her conduct as whispers begin, alliances shift, and she finds herself both criticized and praised for exposing the verity, but unlike Hope, Daphne doesn't deteriorate under the weight of it, because she understands that verity, no matter how destructive, has a way of clearing paths that lies only block, and indeed as she questions whether there was a gentler way, she refuses to apologize for refusing to let a false narrative continue, knowing that allowing Carter to make a life on misinformation would have been a deeper treason than any temporary pain caused by honesty, and as days turn into weeks, the ripples from the DNA report widen, affecting not just Hope and Carter but everyone connected to them, because exposures like this don't live in insulation, they force families to re-evaluate histories, commitment, and hypotheticals, dragging old secrets into the light and proving that the history is no way as buried as people suppose. And Hope finds herself facing judgment not just from others but from within, visited by the interpretation of herself she came when sweat took the wheel, realizing that love driven by despair can still transfigure into commodity unrecognizable, commodity able of causing the veritably desolation it was meant to help, and the loneliness that follows Carter's absence becomes a constant memorial of what she lost, not just a mate, but a sense of certainty about who she was when she was with him. Because now every memory feels tainted by the knowledge of what she withheld, turning joy into remorse and affection into guilt, and when she eventually crosses paths with Carter again, the pressure is unsupportable, heavy with implied words and undetermined pain, and though their eyes meet and the love is still there, unmistakable and paining, it's joined by commodity stronger and further irremovable, a wall erected from broken trust and unanswered questions, and Carter's restraint is what hurts Hope the most. Because wrathfulness she could fight, condemn she could argue against, but this quiet distance, this calm certainty that walking down was necessary, leaves her with nothing to push back against except the verity itself. And as he tells her that he hopes one day she understands why he'd to leave, that staying would have meant betraying himself, Hope realizes that this bifurcation isn't just the end of a love, it's a turning point that will define who they come next, forcing her to defy the uncomfortable reality that love doesn't vindicate deception, that intentions don't abolish impact, and that some losses are meant to educate rather than discipline. And as she begins the slow, painful process of rebuilding herself without Carter, Hope is left to grapple with the knowledge that while Daphne's DNA disclosure ended her relationship, it also stripped down visions she desperately demanded to lose, because only now, in the wreckage, does she begin to understand that real love isn't about guarding issues, it's about trusting someone enough to let them choose the verity, indeed if that choice leads them down from you, and this consummation, though ruinous, becomes the first fragile step toward redemption, growth, and a future shaped not by fear, but by honesty hard-earned through loss, proving that while the DNA report changed everything, the choices made subsequently will determine whether the destruction marks the end of Hope's story or the painful mourning of a further voracious bone. And as that painful mourning sluggishly unfolds, Hope finds herself standing at the edge of an identity she no longer recognizes, because without Carter anchoring her sense of purpose and without the precisely constructed narrative she formerly reckoned on to justify her choices, she's forced to sit with the uncomfortable silence of responsibility, and that silence becomes louder than any battle ever was, filling her days with recollections she can't escape and questions she can no longer avoid, while the city, the family, the connected web of connections that formerly felt familiar now feels like a hall of hypercritical glasses reflecting every misstep back at her, and she realizes that the true cost of the DNA disclosure isn't just the loss of Carter, it's the loss of certainty, the collapse of the belief that she could manage issues by controlling information. Because now she understands that love manipulated by fear inescapably corrodes from the inside, and this mindfulness follows her far and wide, from quiet mornings where she artificially reaches for her phone to textbook Carter before flashing back he's no longer hers to reach for, to restless nights where sleep refuses to come because every dream ends the same way, with him walking down and her standing helplessly before, calling out too late, and yet indeed in this despair, commodity begins to shift, not dramatically or heroically, but subtly, as pain forces reflection and reflection forces growth, and Hope begins to examine not just this one ruinous decision but a pattern of jest. Embedded in abandonment, in the deep-seated belief that love must be guarded, managed, and defended at all costs, indeed if that cost is honesty itself, and as she traces this belief back through her history, through moments of loss and insecurity that tutored her survival frequently meant secretiveness, she starts to understand that while her conduct caused real detriment, they were born from injuries she no way duly conceded, and this understanding doesn't vindicate her. But it does humanize her in her own eyes, offering a fragile pathway toward tone remission, indeed as the world around her remains less forgiving, because whispers still follow her, opinions still harden, and Daphne's name remains permanently tied to the moment everything fell piecemeal. Yet Hope's perception of Daphne sluggishly evolves from resentment to reticent respect, because despite the pain, she cannot deny that Daphne did what Hope could not, she chose verity over comfort, reality over vision, and in time Hope begins to see that Daphne's disclosure, while disastrous, averted an unborn erected on deeper deception, one that would have inescapably collapsed with indeed lesser destruction. And this consummation becomes another bitter lozenge she must swallow as she accepts that occasionally the person who ends your happiness is also the bone who saves you from a far worse fate, and meanwhile Carter continues forward on his own path, carrying the weight of heartache with a quiet quality that only deepens Hope's remorse, because he doesn't lash out or seek vengeance, he simply chooses distance, mending, and tone respect, fastening on rebuilding his sense of trust not just in others but in himself, learning to hear to instincts he formerly ignored, and though he misses Hope, the moments still catch him off guard and recollections face unasked, he understands that returning would mean betraying the boundary he fought so hard to establish, and this conviction becomes his anchor as he navigates a future that feels emptier but further honest, and the irony isn't lost on either of them that the love they participated was real, deep, and transformative, yet still not enough to survive the verity withheld. Because love without translucency becomes fragile, no matter how violent or sincere it feels, and as months pass and the original shock of the DNA disclosure fades into an endless scar rather than an open crack, both Hope and Carter begin to evolve in ways they no way would have if everything had remained retired, because pain, when faced rather than avoided, has a way of reshaping precedences and clarifying values, and Hope, in particular, begins to rebuild her life piece by piece, fastening not on reclaiming what she lost but on getting someone who would no way make the same choice again, someone who understands that honesty isn't a threat to love but a prerequisite for it, and though the trip is slow and frequently lonely. She starts to find strength in responsibility, learning that growth doesn't come from defending one's conduct but from admitting them completely and choosing else going forward. And when she eventually allows herself to imagine a future again, it isn't centered on winning Carter back or rewriting history, but on living genuinely, indeed when authenticity feels intimidating. And this shift marks a profound change in her character, one born not from triumph but from ruin, while Daphne, observing from a distance, sees the long-term consequences of her decision play out and recognizes that Verity infrequently delivers clean palms, only complicated issues that demand adaptability from everyone involved, and she too carries the weight of what she exposed, understanding that being right doesn't always feel like winning, yet still believing that integrity matters more than temporary harmony. And as the community sluggishly adjusts to the new normal created by the DNA report, connections realign, secrets lose their power, and the vision of control numerous once clung to is replaced by a harder but more honest reality, and through it all the story of Hope and Carter becomes an exemplary tale rumored not with atrocity but with solemn understanding, a memorial that love tested by Verity either deepens or breaks, but can no way remain unchanged. And when Hope and Carter cross paths one final time, not in battle or craving, but in collective acknowledgement of what was and what can no way be again, there's a quiet peace in the absence of bitterness, because both have grown enough to faith that their love, though genuine, served its purpose in shaping who they demanded to come, and as they part ways with soft grins and implied gratefulness, Hope realizes that the DNA disclosure didn't just end a relationship, it disassembled an interpretation of herself that couldn't survive honesty, making room for someone stronger, more tone-apprehensive, and able of loving without fear, and while the pain of loss no way completely disappears, it transforms into wisdom, carrying with it the understanding that occasionally everything has to fall piecemeal for the Verity to eventually take root, and in that Verity, still painful, lies the possibility of an unborn erected not on secrets and control, but on courage, translucency, and the hard-earned knowledge that real love begins where fear ends. And as that courage sluggishly begins to define Hope's days rather than fear, the metamorphosis within her becomes apparent not in grand gestures but in the quiet, nearly unnoticeable choices she makes when no bone is watching, choices to speak plainly indeed when her voice trembles, to defy uncomfortable trueness rather of reshaping them into commodity safer, and to sit with consequences rather than overrun them, because the loss of Carter has tutored her that avoidance only detainments pain, it no way prevents it, and this assignment echoes through every commerce she has moving forward, reshaping how she engages with family, with musketeers, and with herself, while the shadow of the DNA disclosure continues to impend large over the community, not as a reproach presently but as a reference point, a ahead and after marker that divides lives into who they were before the Verity and who they came after it, and Hope cannot escape being at the center of that peak, yet over time she stops trying to, understanding that redemption doesn't come from erasing the history but from integrating it actually into the present, and this acceptance becomes both her burden and her emancipation, because while it forces her to admit the detriment she caused, it also frees her from the exhausting task of maintaining a false image, and in that freedom she begins to rediscover pieces of herself that were lost long before Carter ever entered her life, corridor that was before love came commodity she felt she had to secure at any cost, and meanwhile Carter's life continues to unfold in a quieter, steadier meter, one marked by purposeful distance from emotional chaos and a renewed commitment to tone respect, and though the pain of the bifurcation still shells suddenly, frequently in moments of solitariness or familiarity, it no longer dominates him, because he has learned that walking down wasn't a failure of love but an act of tone preservation, and this understanding strengthens him, allowing him to trust again, sluggishly and cautiously, without surrendering his boundaries, and indeed as new connections form, Hope remains a defining chapter in his story, not as a source of bitterness but as an assignment in perceptiveness, a memorial that love must be embedded in collective honesty to endure, and this participated elaboration, though separate, underscores the enduring impact of Daphne's disclosure, because while she remains a controversial figure in the narrative, time softens the original outrage and reframes her part as someone who forced a reckoning that numerous had long avoided, and Daphne herself grapples with this heritage, apprehensive that being the deliverer of Verity frequently means standing alone in its fate, misneu and judged for issues she didn't orchestrate but simply revealed, and yet she doesn't lament her choice, because she has seen the long-term goods of honesty taking hold, watched secrets lose their grip, and witnessed growth crop from desolation, and this reinforces her belief that verity, though cruel in its timing, eventually clears the path for genuine mending. And as seasons change and life moves forward, the story of Hope and Carter becomes lower about the bifurcation itself.